What's up, Wesley? Welcome back to the Charleston Wesley podcast, where we make ministry available on the go. I'm Ava, and I'm the Wesley worship intern.
And I'm John, and I'm serving as the pastor of the Wesley Foundation. And again, we have the same special guest as last week joining us, Hannah Poole.
Woo! Like I shared last week, I'm John's wife, and I just volunteer a good bit with Wesley in my free time.
And just to add a little bit to kind of your introduction last week, what is one of your specific ministerial focuses in the Wesley Foundation?
I guess the most specific one that's, transitioning with me from last year to this year will be helping run the women's ministry and give some of our student leaders the opportunity to really take that ministry and grow it and grow each other.
Yeah, and Hannah also, she's present for a lot of Wesley stuff. She teaches sometimes too, and preaches sometimes. So, if you haven't met Hannah, you will enjoy getting to know Hannah. But how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Got a little bit of a cough going on, so hopefully that doesn't interfere with the recording, but we'll survive.
How are you, Ava?
I'm pretty good. I also kind of feel like I have a tickle in my throat, so it's fine. It'll be fine. I'm just going to try not to cough into the mic.
How are you doing, John?
Thanks for asking. I am a little tired. I probably should have made a cup of coffee before this one, but that's okay. Because I have been looking forward to this episode because I think this is something that needs to be talked about. And it is the fact that church hurt does exist. And in our discussion today, we're not trying to blame one church over other churches. Every church fails to be the church that Christ calls them to be. Everyone has different experiences with church, and my prayer is that no one experiences church hurt. But the truth is that some people do. The other thing that I just do need to give voice to is in the United Methodist Church and in the Global Methodist Church, there is church hurt. There is a bit of a schism going on right now. Churches are separating. They're deciding that they are going to minister in different avenues. And our discussion today really isn't commentary on whether that's right or wrong, whether they should or they shouldn't. But I think everyone involved in those situations realizes that feelings are hurt. No matter which way you slice it, someone's feelings are going to be hurt. And the truth is that there's a lot of students that are coming to Charleston who are experiencing that, or who are experiencing this weird transition season for their home church. And so just wanted to give voice to that. We're not here to judge. We're not here to do any of that. We're just really here to talk about kind of what church hurt looks like, how it manifests itself, and what we do in response to it. And the reason that we have Hannah on this is because Hannah could kind of speak for some personal experience of church hurt. And so I'm just going to kind of turn it over to you to tell them a little bit about what happened and what it did to you spiritually, emotionally, whatever you want. And then later in the episode, we'll talk about how you've kind of navigated through that.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to start by saying, I'm going to intentionally kind of keep details vague. I'm not going to name the church, just out of respect for them, because while I experienced church hurt from them, I do recognize that in many ways, they were trying to be the church that God called them to be, even though things might have been handled maybe not the best. So just out of respect for them, I'm going to keep some of the details vague. And I do also, I guess, just kind of want to preface the discussion about splitting from the UMC or not. That really isn't a big factor in my church hurt story. It was definitely going on at the time, and so I don't think that really helped. But for me specifically, that wasn't a big factor. But I do agree with everything John just prefaced, and wanted to appreciate that. But, so I guess there's kind of really two instances I can think of with this specific church, which sounds kind of bad when you just look at it like that. But the first time it happened, it was when I was in a position there and I was working for the church. And I think most of that really stemmed from just kind of like the church politics that come from working at a church, and kind of like the burnout that I was starting to get with that. And I won't go too much into detail about the burnout because I believe we'll be having an episode on burnout later down the road. So that first time I just recognized that like a big part of that cause of like the hurt I was feeling was burnout. So I just kind of took a step back. I stepped down from the role that I was in, and I just took some time off from that church and took some time for myself to really just kind of like regroup, and I guess get to a better spiritual place where I needed to be. Unfortunately, I don't think I plugged into a different church at the time, and I really should have, because I do think that would have expedited that process, but I think it was mostly like personal devotions and stuff to kind of get me through that. But I want to say I maybe took a month off from attending that church and participating a whole lot there, and then was just like right back in the swing of things. So I wanted to mention that because that part of this story shows that like there's kind of a spectrum and a range of like how churches can hurt you. There are some things that are just like smaller and minor, and even then I don't necessarily think that was like the whole church that it felt like it hurt me. It was just kind of like more of the inner workings that were feeling like they were hurting me at the time. So like there are smaller instances where you might feel like a church is hurting you, but then unfortunately the next time that I felt like I was hurt by this church was years down the road at that point. Things had been going really well. Again, I really loved that church and just getting to be a part of it. I was very active in it. Again, I'd stepped into a very part-time role at that church, and then I was active in the choir at that church and just really doing a lot. Again, loved all the people. But we had gone on a trip with this church, and there was an incident. And so technically, I was not the one running that trip, but I was the one who was like on paperwork, the one hired by the church at that time. So like when it came to this incident, I was the one that kind of had to handle it. And I did everything right on my end. Did everything that I was supposed to, but there were just some people involved that didn't appreciate that big word incident, because unfortunately that does make it sound like it's more serious than it was. And the fact of the matter is that the incident really wasn't all that big of a deal. And so I did what I needed to do, pass it along to other leaders who were supposed to kind of handle it and really take care of it from there. And unfortunately, we got back to Charleston, and things were not handled the best by these other parties. And I was just kind of caught in the middle of it and really given a lot more blame for the situation than I even had. And I was getting a lot more heat for it than I even had or should have. But I think the thing that sticks out to me the most and that makes it hurt the most is one of the families that was involved got very frustrated and upset. And I remember, I don't think they told me, but someone mentioned to me that they didn't appreciate how everyone knew, and we were telling, like I was telling everybody, and that just wasn't true. Like, I had not told anybody what happened out of respect for them, just like I'm not really saying much about what happened now. Like, out of respect for them, I didn't tell anybody but the person I was supposed to, and like the policy was written on paper, and that's the policy I followed. Those are the only people I told. But the fact of the matter is, like, other people were finding out, but it wasn't from me. It was from these families that were involved. So I think it hurt the most because I knew I was doing everything I was supposed to, and I was doing everything right. But it still felt like everybody knew. It felt like the whole church knew this whole thing was going on, which was me being a little overdramatic. I recognize not everybody knew. But I knew there were more people that knew than should have. And so there was that weight and stress and pressure of just not knowing who knew what and how much they knew. But it really just kind of felt like it was everyone against me at that point. Because the families involved were very, very ingrained in that church for a very long time. And so like that, it really did feel like it was just them versus me. And I continued going to church. I continued in the position I was in for a little while. And, I just tried my hardest to be there and be present. But every Sunday morning I was waking up and I was dreading going to church. And because of that, like, unfortunately, I just wasn't, like, filling the position that I was hired for the best that I could have been, just because there was just so much hurt there. And then, like, it just also kept following me. I remember, because I do teach kindergarten, so I was also a kindergarten teacher at the time. And so I remember just my 30-minute drive to and from school every day were the worst part of my days for months, because I'm alone in my car with nothing to take my mind off of this thing that happened. And there was just so much guilt that I felt for it, when really it wasn't on me to feel guilty for. And I don't remember what else I was supposed to kind of tie in with that at this point, but that's...
well, I guess the only other... Well, actually, we can get into it in a little bit. But,
okay.
I mean, I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, so I guess that's my background of, like, my
That was
experience.
a really articulate way of... I mean, I was there for all that, so, like...
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, but, like, hearing you say it that way was actually, like, a really well done, I think.
Well, thank you.
And that was a tough season for Hannah and I, because I had just started Wesley.
Mm-hmm. And we just finished, like, 1 year of marriage, which...
Sorry,
we're on like a wooden table, so we try not to make noise.
I shifted. My bad.
But yeah, and so like we just finished 1 year of marriage, and like for some reason first year of marriage is just real rough, so we'd like just come through that, and then now all of this happens.
I had just started seminary.
Just started
Wesley.
A lot going
Was that your
on.
first year teaching?
No, it wasn't.
Okay.
I thought a lot about that, but it was actually my second year teaching, which
Okay, well that's good.
was a little easier than if it was my first year, but really not much easier.
Yeah. But I appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
And I will share, while I was a part of that situation, and it affected me too, I actually experienced some church hurt, as weird as it sounds, from the Wesley Foundation. When I was a student, I was super involved. I was an intern at one point. I was the CFC president at one point, and I was working real hard. And basically, just some clickiness came up, and I just felt super isolated from my whole church family. And also, I felt very unheard and unseen. And a little bit of it is like, I probably should have extended a lot more grace to the director at the time. But I just distinctly remember that there was a Bible study once, and we were looking at other religions, and I was at a table with just some students that I didn't really know, but I was helping lead the discussion. And we were talking about Islam, and someone said that we need to bomb the desert until the sand glows.
Whoa.
And I went to the director and I said, like, we can't do that. Like, you have to say something. And he, it seemed as if nothing was said. And then the same thing came up with Mormons. We were talking about Mormons, and everyone started ragging on Mormons, and I sat at a table, and I was getting real frustrated at this point, and I just like pointed out to him, I was like, well, when's the last time you took a year off to serve other people? And like no one had any response to me, and they all thought that I was being a jerk. And then there was just like other things, like people would just say really terrible things at Wesley. I mean, they'd throw around, the R word for mentally disabled people like it was funny. I heard people say like racial slurs. There was a lot of sexism, and I was so fed up because I was like, what are we even doing? And then also just because of the politics, I was actively losing my community. And so it just sucked. Like, there's no other way to put it, is I just felt so put out by the Wesley Foundation, which is one of the reasons why when this position was offered to me, I was really hesitant because I was afraid of being in that community. And then it didn't dawn on me that it's kind of up to me to decide. But I will say in this role, too, a lot of students talk to me about where the church is messed up, and that's always tough for me to hear. And I am a pastor. I am clergy, and for whatever it means to you, I want to apologize on behalf of the church for whatever hurt you were going through. I know it wasn't me. I know it probably wasn't the Wesley Foundation. Might not have been the United Methodist Church, but I'm sorry. And with that being said, I think we should kind of parse out what exactly is church hurt. So, what when you hear that word, what do y'all think of?
I'm probably gonna steal your thunder a little bit, but one of the things that I feel like I hear you say all the time is when the church fails to be the church, and we can look at scriptures and see that happen. But I do think that's a big part of church hurt, is when the church fails to be the church. And I think, unfortunately, there are many cases where churches are just trying their best and trying to do what they feel like God is calling them to do, and just don't realize that what they're doing is actually causing hurt. Like my first experience, when it was just kind of like the church politics, really. Like, I don't think anyone was trying to hurt me, or the church was trying to hurt me. But I do think there was at least a little bit of that, like, kind of failing to be the church there. And so just the, I guess, side effects were getting caught in the crossfires.
Yeah, I think a lot of church hurt can also be summed up as, like, you're talking about effects, the effect of people just not feeling welcome anymore, or not feeling comfortable in a space anymore. Preface, though, I mean, to some degree, there are times where you're going to feel uncomfortable in church, but I'm talking about more on a consistent basis, and normally because of the church body, not because of, like, the doctrine or anything,
Yeah, I would say one thing to note when we talk about church hurt is the reason it hurts so much is because you really love the church.
Yeah.
And the part about church hurt that makes it so tough is that there's so many other good memories. And church hurt can kind of stain those memories. And so that's a really tragic part of it. But Hannah, you did kind of steal my thunder. Like, it is the church failing to be the church. But we also have to realize that, like, we play a factor in our experience of church hurt. I mean, sometimes we're the cause of it. Sometimes we're responsible for it. Sometimes it's our response that should have been the more Christ-like. But ultimately, the church exists to glorify God and serve God's people. And church hurt is just a break in that function. And so what are some examples of church hurt that you've heard of, experienced, however you want to take it, or just ones that you are hyper aware of that would really freak you out to see?
I mean, like, well, I've shared some, like, personal experience of church hurt, but then I think just, like, there are some of the unfortunate ones where it's just kind of like abuse that's happening within the church. And I'm sure there's more, but now I'm drawing a blank. So anyone else want to take it away?
For me, like, just a general one that I think there's a lot of people that can relate to is church gossip. And,
Ooh, that's a good
you know,
one, yeah.
I cannot say anything. I am horrible about gossiping. Like, a lot of my friends and I even talk about it when we're in the heat of the moment and, like, getting into it. And then we're like, wait a second. This is not being very Christ-like, you know? And so I think gossiping for sure, and kind of what you were touching on earlier, speaking without fully knowing the lives of the people around you. You know, when we, especially in a college group, we have a different sort of language and a different sort of way of talking than even older folks or younger folks. And sometimes things just get thrown around where then later on you'll realize, like, oh, maybe I shouldn't have joked about that. Or, like, maybe that came out, maybe that was a little bit too dark to make light of, you know, like stuff like that, where I think sometimes in a church body we assume that everyone's just like us, and that's just not the case. You never know what someone has going on, you know, behind closed doors. And so, yeah, a lot of mine has to do with communication, how we're talking about other people, how we're expressing ourselves. Yeah.
I would say some big ones that are famous, you know, that get all the press. Toxic leadership.
That too.
One of the things that I love about Methodist churches in general is that there's a lot of checks and balances. I am unsettled at the idea of, like, having unlimited power in ministry. like it freaks me out. But the fact is that I have to report to a board of directors. I have to report to a district superintendent. I have to report to a bishop. Like, I like that because I am stupid and I'm fallen and I mess up, and I need people to point out that brokenness to me. So toxic leadership is definitely a thing, and some denominations are more pastor-centered and driven, and that's fine. But I still hold that you need to realize that clergy are people too. There's nothing special about us. There's nothing magical about us. And you need to govern yourself accordingly if there's some strange power dynamics that come up. Because there's also just, and like, this is just a tough episode to talk about, so we're just going to go ahead and like rip the Band-Aid off. But that also extends to other things like youth leaders and Boy Scouts leaders and things like that. And the truth is that a big issue that has happened in the church historically, and unfortunately still happens today, is child abuse, is sexual abuse. And it's unsettling, the statistics that come out. And that is what I can't think of a greater example of just like going against all that God wishes than like harming a child. There's also stories of fraud and embezzlement where these people are giving money, they're trying to give back to God, and there are pastors and church secretaries and all different types of people who have siphoned that money off to buy the new Lexus or whatever. And I will also just throw out that there are some in ministry that think that it's okay there are some pastors that think it's okay to fly first class everywhere. And they have their parishioners give to the church to do that. And there are some that think that they need the private jet. And there are some that need all of these things in the multi-million-dollar house. And the truth is that pastors who are listening, because I know that you are definitely checking this podcast out, y'all don't need that. You don't need that. And I think that there's a lot of hurt in there. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying the fine life, but there is something wrong with asking the church to fund things for you to embellish your grandeur. Those are just some of the examples that came to mind for me. And I guess kind of going back to Hannah, you know, how does church hurt? How did it affect your personal faith and relationship with God and the church? Not necessarily the individual church, but the church as a whole.
Yeah. So like with the first, like the smaller situation that I mentioned, it mostly impacted my relationship with the church. It didn't have as much impact on my relationship with God. I think I was just kind of already in a rockier spot due to the burnout, and so That one was just really a time where like I just really had to recognize that I wasn't in the place I needed to be, and I had to like work hard to get back to that, and just like actually dive deep into my Bible and just really lean on God more with that one. But the second time around, like the bigger example of church hurt that I had, like it almost destroyed, I guess. Well, like it almost destroyed my relationship with church, but like it, I guess, put a pretty big pause on my relationship with God too. And like we mentioned, like John and I were married at the time. He just started as the director and pastor of the Wesley Foundation. And so, like, if that was not the case, I really think I would have just taken such a long break from church. And I don't think I really would have gone back for quite a while. But, you know, it's not the best look for a pastor's wife to be skipping out on church every week. So I officially stopped going to that church in December, the end of December, just before Christmas, and I think it was maybe middle of January when I finally went back to like a church in person. And yeah, like I just think if I hadn't been married to John, a pastor, I would have probably taken quite some time off from definitely from church, but like honestly quite likely from my relationship with God, which is just kind of like terrible to think about. So I guess in that regard I'm pretty lucky that I had that just force kind of pushing me to stay on track.
Yeah.
Well, like I think to add on to kind of what you were saying, a point to mention is that like congregations, I think anyone in a congregation needs to remember that they can be a reflection of God. Like they might be the only example of God that a person might see. And so I think sometimes if a church, you know, makes you feel unwelcome, then you might also feel unwelcome, like with God, which isn't true at all. But that's what I've seen a lot in media. You know, you were mentioning some like bigger issues earlier. A lot of the time comment sections or stuff are like, well, this is like why I don't believe in God, you know, how can this be going on with people that worship God? I'm like, because they're the people, not God, you know, like they're very flawed. And so I think that's like the big danger of church hurt is that a lot of people won't realize that it's the individuals, you know, and not the bigger picture God, you know.
Like for context, like I grew up going to church almost every week, and then when I was in college I went to church almost every week, if not every week. And so like my faith and like relationship with church has always been like very serious and like big part of my life, and like this whole experience still almost kind of drove me away from church. I don't think it would have fully driven me away from faith, but like that's kind of the extent that it can get you, and I don't think anyone ever fully grasps that when we're, I guess, doing things that we think are best and haven't, I guess, maybe fully processed consequences. But you looked like you were about to say something.
I mean, I think that y'all kind of hit the nail on the head with a lot of it, and kind of transitioning into the Bible focus. This was a really tough one to kind of think through from a biblical point of view. But one of the things that I'm going to lift up that it's scientific, not necessarily biblical, but they did some research in people who've experienced church hurt, and they kind of studied their heart rates when they would go to just church settings in general. And the pattern was similar to those people who suffer from PTSD.
Wow.
And so we need to realize that like this is actually like trauma. Like our body interprets it as like a major trauma. And we should not ignore that. And that's why this is such a sensitive thing, is because whether or not it's a big deal or a small deal, the body still sees it as like danger to itself. And so I wanted to give voice to that. But the other thing that Ava kind of lifted up is the church is made up. I was talking with someone, it was one of my classmates, and she's a pastor, and she was saying that ministry is a lot of fun, but people be peopling. And the truth is that the church would be great if it wasn't for all the people. You know what I mean? Like, we all mess up. We are all broken. We're all fallen. And it's just hard, because the church is also a place of love and trust and relationship. And to have that schism is it's just a very tough thing. And I will also offer up that I think the demographic that deals with the most church hurt is actually pastors, because we have to deal with just a lot of upsetting things as far as church members coming up to us and saying that we're doing everything wrong, and that, you know, we don't actually know what we're talking about, or that we're foolish, or that the old pastor didn't do it this way, or all these things. And so, you know, we are the ones that are really raked over the coals for when stuff comes up in church. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why it can be easy for a pastor to mess up and accidentally cause church hurt, because pastors need to grieve in their own way. We all need to find some time for ourselves. And that also applies to just church leadership in general, is that it's really tough to be a church leader and not be kind of hit with the same blows that church hurt deals. But the other thing, I was thinking about this and it just kind of struck me, is that I think the person that experiences the most church hurt and has experienced it the most is Christ. I mean, they killed him, you know, and not only did they kill him, but they did everything else to him too. And the fact that Christ has been through these feelings is a comfort to those of us who are going through those feelings, because we can realize that our God knows what it's like to be on the receiving end of church hurt. And we see in the Gospels a lot of examples of the Pharisees and the Sadducees hurting people. The people who were sick, who were deemed unclean to come to synagogue. The people who were tax collectors, who were banished from church. The people who were accused of adultery, you know, being brought to Christ and about to be stoned. And we see each and every time that Christ extends grace, and Christ tries to teach them that this is not how it should be. And the truth is that it shouldn't. And so we kind of need to offer some grace to all those involved. And in that, knowing that Christ has been through church hurt, you know, Christ wouldn't have gone through it all if he didn't really love the church. And I think we should lift up the fact that the church is a very beautiful thing. And we are also, not every church deals church hurt. In fact, very few deal church hurt. Most churches are doing great things. Most churches are healthy and happy and all that good stuff. And so I don't want to make it seem like if you're a Christian, you are going to deal with this. This is more so for the people the very few who will deal with it. And now we're kind of transitioning into talking about, well, how do we get through that? And so, Hannah, you obviously are going to church again, but talk to us about some of the emotions that came up that first time or the first few times, and then also kind of how you've tried to get over and past this trauma.
Yeah, so, sorry. I mentioned that December was when I stopped going to my old church. And, I mean, it was just before Christmas, so, you know, obviously I still went to Christmas Eve service and all that sort of stuff. And that might have been the year Christmas was on a Sunday. No, never mind. Still went to Christmas Eve service and everything, but I think shortly...
Oh, no, I think you're right. I'm sorry. Yeah, you were 100% right. That was the year that Christmas was on Sunday.
So then, yeah, like we doubled down, did Christmas Eve service, did Christmas morning service.
Well, we were in Hilton Head for those. That's why I remembered them.
Yeah, we still did. We still did them though.
And, I'm being dumb. I'm sorry.
And so like that kind of helped not pause, and because we were on Hilton Head with my family, there wasn't as much of that, I guess, stress of going to church again for the first time, because it wasn't like it wasn't I was looking for a new church to go to. It was I was going to my family's church with them for the holiday service. But then getting back to Charleston, needing to get back into the swing of things and finding a new church. I think John had just gone out of town for something. And so I woke up, he was out of town. I woke up that Sunday morning and I was like, I can't do it. I knew the church that I was going to try to go to, and I was just like, I can't go by myself. And so I just didn't. I remember watching church on my phone while I was doing the dishes, just to kind of scope that church out a little bit more. And then I was like, okay, that's good enough for this week. I checked the box. I did church. Then the next week rolls around, and John has to go who knows where for church. So again, I'm faced with the, okay, I've got to go to church alone situation. I'm like, well, I can't do it 2 weeks in a row where I just suck it up and don't go. And so I went, and like I mentioned in last week's episode, for better or worse, I showed up just a few minutes late so I didn't have to deal with all of the, just like, I guess kind of awkward talking to everybody who's so welcoming and so happy that I'm at their church. And I guess
don't know if that's church hurt or just you being an introvert. But
I
maybe
I think it's definitely stemmed from me being an introvert, but I think the church hurt definitely did not help, because I already did not want to be going to this church. Like, I was forcing myself to go because I knew I had to, not because I wanted to. And so I went to this church, and the reason I chose that church is because the pastor there, he and John started at their respective appointments the same year, and so they kind of met each other that way. And so this pastor and his wife had us over for a game night, and they were just like really good people. And I was like, okay, I think that's where I need to try. So I go to that church, get there a few minutes late. It's great. I'm doing as good as you would expect me to be, and all of a sudden, we're doing, I think it must be like the praises and prayers, and the pastor Brent, he's like, yeah, and we've got a praise today. Hannah Poole is here. Her husband John does the Wesley Foundation. And the turtle from Robin Hood that just like constantly is going in the shell. That was me in that moment. I just wanted to go in my little shell and just not be seen again. And so like in that moment I was like petrified. I can look back at it and laugh now. But yeah, so then that happens and I'm like, okay, this is just great. But then I leave and go home, and I don't remember if I texted it to you, but I remember I think I might have called my friend on my way home, and I just told her, like, I think this is where I need to be to find healing. Like, I don't necessarily think it's going to be at the time, I didn't necessarily think it was going to be my forever church home, but like, I think I left feeling just so relieved. And I'm not a crier, but I'm pretty sure like that car ride home, like I just started crying just from the relief of finding a place where I just felt like I could, I guess grow again. But yeah, so like, I guess that was part of it. And just kind of getting back in the swing of things. So that honestly, and I'm sure it'll come up again in a little bit, but that would be my biggest recommendation to anyone who's still kind of in the thick of it is make yourself go to a church. And I phrase that intentionally because you most likely are going to have to actually just like force yourself to go. And then like wherever you land, like don't necessarily be worried about finding your like new church home. Find a church that you feel like you will be able to get that healing from. Because that's what I did, and it has helped me a whole lot. And it helped me a lot with the forgiveness process. I still don't think have fully forgiven them, but I do think I've come a long way in that process just because I was able to find a church that provided me a place for healing.
Yeah. And I will say, like, if you're like terrified of going to church, we mentioned this last time. But if you're terrified about going to church by yourself, if you're in Charleston, we'll help you out. Like we got friends that can go to church with you. But I'm glad that you brought up forgiveness, because forgiveness just plays a role in all healing and in all recovery processes. And so I guess like what do you think the role of forgiveness plays in healing from the church hurt?
I think like the phrase "forgive but not forget" gets thrown around a lot. And it's a good phrase, but there's some things that, like, in your life maybe you want to forget. Because some church hurt, maybe you can get past it, And you can practice forgiveness because, you're remembering that we're all flawed, And then sometimes it's better to, remember that and just move on. But either way, like, I think forgiveness opens the door for each of those. Either to move on at the same church or to move on at a different church. I think that first step, though, is letting it go so it doesn't, again, affect your next church experience.
We were actually talking about it on the way over here. But there's a quote, I can't remember who said it now, even though we just looked it up, but it's talking about how to forgive is to set a prisoner free, but what you don't realize is that you're the prisoner that's being set free when you offer forgiveness, and that's a paraphrase. But I think that, because that same idea was mentioned in a sermon I heard, I guess, a few months back. And I think that's when it all, like, really kind of clicked for me. And I do think that kind of goes along with the whole, like, forgive and not forget. Like, I, like, clearly have not forgotten all of this stuff that's happened. But because I've been a little more intentional about forgiving, like, I feel like I've been able to just kind of like release all of that like anger and frustration that's been associated with it, and that's really just kind of helped me, I guess, get to fully or more fully move on. But yeah, do you have anything to add, John?
I think that you kind of summed it up, but forgiveness just releases you, and so to forgive is I think critical in that. And you also need to kind of forgive yourself for whatever you did, because you typically our reaction to church hurt is not great. And so how can we, as members of church communities, try to keep church hurt from happening?
For me, I think it's just not being scared to hold others accountable for their actions. I'm not saying at all to like call someone out publicly, but I think I've had moments in Wesley where someone will say something out loud in a group, and later on I probably should have pulled them inside and been like, hey, we don't really talk like that here. You might make some people not feel great, but I just got so scared to do that when, I don't know, I think that's probably the right move I should have made. But yeah, I think just holding people accountable.
I definitely agree with that, and we've been doing a book club this summer, and I think this kind of came up in book club a little bit this past week, but I mentioned it then, and I think it kind of relates now, but I think in many ways churches kind of could go back to the basics and really use a good refresher, like, okay, who are we? Whose are we? And what does that mean for us and how we should act and live in a church setting, but also day to day. And so I think that could go a long way, because the fact of the matter is, even if you are a happy, healthy church and like no problems with like church hurt or anything like that, like those things are always relevant. So I think if more of us as, I guess, church communities, but then also as individuals, if we kind of went back to the basics with those, I think that kind of helps prevent a little bit. But also, I think as church members and church leaders, I feel like a lot of times it's easy to see when someone is starting to get hurt. You might not be there at the beginning and be able to prevent it, but you can see that someone is starting to hurt, and I think it's kind of our responsibility to be like, hey, what's going on? How can I help you? Whether it's helping them through it or like intervening, and so you can put a stop to something. Because I know in both of the situations I listed, it was probably fairly obvious that I was not in a great spot. And I just don't think I had anybody really reach out and be like, hey, this, like, you're not doing great. What can I do to help you get back to where you need to be? And so I think that if we are intentional about looking out for others, that might not stop it from happening altogether, but it could stop it from getting worse. And I think that's almost as important.
I think there's a handful of things that we as church members should do. Transparency is important to me. I think that everything should be above board. I really don't think that there's like much room for like closed meetings unless it's like confidential information. So I like transparency. I hold that dear. I also just think that the church needs to remember grace. I talk about grace a lot because I think grace is a very important thing. And we need to extend grace to those who have hurt us, and we need to extend grace to those who we have hurt and they have reacted to that. And the other thing, church leaders, you need to start taking breaks, and you need to process your own church hurt, because it just kills you. And that's coming from like a young person in ministry. I know, like, there's people who've been in ministry for 30 years, but there's a lot of hurt that we can take on, and it just doesn't get processed well. And so, but that also applies to kind of student leaders. Y'all need to take breaks, and y'all need to be poured into, and this kind of comes up with burnout. But the other thing is we need to be confessorial and repentant. We need to confess and we need to repent. And I'm going to offer up just a quick story. There was a student who disconnected from Wesley before I became the director, and everyone kept talking about this student and how they were super involved. They were a leader, they were on everything, and they were super on fire for Wesley. And then they just unplugged mysteriously about 4 or 5 months before I started. And so finally I kept on seeing him everywhere, and we spoke, and he was like, yeah, I used to go to Wesley. And so finally I just asked him, I said, could we get lunch, and could you tell me what happened? Because I don't know, and I'm trying to figure out how to refine this ministry, because something happened, and I just want to know. And so anyway, we sat down, and he talked about how he was in a leadership meeting, and he brought up the fact that he wanted to talk about Mother Emanuel and the shooting that took place there, and how he does not, as a black man in America, he does not feel comfortable going to a church that doesn't have a cop in front of it, because he is just afraid of a shooting. Which I've never thought about that as a white man in America. I've never really been worried about that. And he said that his suggestion was ignored, and also some people laughed at him for bringing it up. And that really hurt him. And I was really shocked, and I was trying to think of what to do, and I just realized that the only thing I could do was say I'm sorry. And I told him, I said, listen, I know that I was not the director. I know that that was kind of a different ministry at that time, but I am super sorry, and that should not have happened. And so I think, and he even said that, he was like, that was really great for me. And because I think the whole time he had been kind of thinking that maybe he was the problem. And so we just, churches and church members, we got to realize when we need to apologize. And maybe you weren't the one that did it, but you were part of the system that did it. Mm-hmm. And so for anyone who's listening to what's going on through church hurt, I'm just going to offer up a few things in closing. Hannah lifted up that, it's probably good to not break the rhythm. And I kind of think that one of the reasons Hannah was able to recover in a quicker fashion was because she didn't break the rhythm of going to church too much. The other thing is that you got to realize that people are people, and people need grace. And also, you deserve grace. So, in that, I think that's about all we have for this topic.
Yeah, I think with that, we know what's up with church hurt. If anyone listening has any questions or wants to reach out, you can get to our email. It's wuw@wesleychs.org. And also, if you want to keep listening to other podcasts or just be up to date on our episodes, you can follow and like on whatever platform you're listening to.
And if you want to learn more about the Wesley Foundation, you can go to our website, which is wesleychs.org, or you can check us out on Facebook and Instagram, and that's a good way to stay up to date with all the cool stuff we've been up to. And with that, let's go to God in prayer. God, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this conversation. And God, we just ask that you be with those who are suffering church hurt. Be with those who are feeling isolated, who are feeling alienated, who are feeling traumatized. Help them to realize that you are good, and people need you in order to be good. So, God, we just ask that you comfort and guide those who are experiencing this season, and that you guide them through it, and help them to just realize that the church is a really beautiful thing, and the church is such a wonderful thing to be a part of, and it is such a holy experience to serve in ministry with brothers and sisters. We love you. We thank you. It is in your name that we pray. Amen. Catch you next week.